want to tell you a little bit about traditional muzzleloaders. To me, muzzleloaders are kind of to gun hunting what traditional bows are to bow hunting. They're the old-fashioned way of hunting, the way our forefathers hunted. They're challenging and they're fun. They're a lot of fun. And with either a traditional bow or a traditional muzzleloader, when you're successful with your hunting with one, it just seems like it's more rewarding. You've accomplished something that takes a little more effort. And that seems to be in the opposite direction that a lot of hunters are going today, but they're missing out on a lot of fun. And anyway, the way I look at it. But I've been shooting traditional bows pretty near all my life since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. But sometime in the mid-1960s, I discovered traditional muzzleloaders. And I've been shooting them ever since. And I've graduated to flintlock rifles, which is, I think flintlocks are kind of like longbows in a sense, in their in the way that they challenge you, make it a little bit harder for you, and the rewards are greater. And it's a lot of fun, like I said. I'm going to tell you a little story today about a young buckskinner. And the year was about 1978, when this young skinner had a hankering to kill a moose with a muzzleloader. And this is his story. The year was 1978, when a young buckskinner got a hankering to kill a moose with a muzzleloader. He had a friend that had been to the far reaches of Ontario, Canada many times hunting moose with a modern rifle. The skinner made a pact with his friend that he would teach him the art of fur trapping in exchange for letting him come along on a moose hunt with him the next fall. The deal was made and the lessons began that fall. The following year, 1979, the buckskinner had another good friend who was a very accomplished contemporary gunmaker. He had him make a moose rifle for his hunt that turned into a .62 caliber German Jaeger left-handed flintlock. The skinner practiced diligently that summer with his new rifle to determine the most accurate heavy load with a patched round ball. He ended up with good accuracy with a heavy load behind a .610 round ball. When the older hunter found out that the skinner was going to use a flintlock gun on the hunt, he was not happy. He said, "Are you going to take a modern gun too?" And the skinner said no, he wasn't going to do that, and he just didn't set well with the older man. The plan was to drive to the far north as far as possible in Ontario, going through a small Indian village to where the road ended at a river that flowed north towards James Bay. From there, they embarked on 2 square-stern canoes loaded with all their gear and many cans of gasoline. The skinner had a 17-foot with a 7.5 horse motor. His friend had a 20-foot square-stern with a 10-horse motor. The trip down the river was 40 miles as the crow flies and took all day for them to get to their desired hunting spot. The reason for the location was the moose season had been open for Canadian residents for 2 weeks. Prior to that, non-residents' moose hunt had been pushed far into the bush. They set up camp on the bank of the river and prepared their gear for the following morning hunt. They were so far north the nights were very long and the days were short. Finally, as the day approached, they rose from their beds and started breakfast. The skinner unpacked his skins, stepped out of the tent to load his rifle. The older man was hunting with a modern rifle, just shook his head and said, "Shoot a calf if you see one, they're good eating," to which the skinner answered, "I'm going to shoot a big bull." The other man laughed like he thought that was an impossibility. "Where do you suggest I go?" asked the skinner. The older man, who had hunted this area many times before and killed several moose, said, "Follow the river. Don't go off into the bush or you might get lost. You'll come to a small stream about a mile downriver. You can follow that a ways back, but don't go far from the stream." The Skinner started off on his trek down the river, going very slowly, scanning ahead for any movement and listening for any sound. He continued to follow the river, marveling at the beauty of the Canadian bush country. The Skinner finally came to the small stream that flowed into the main river. It was narrow enough in places to jump across, but it seemed to have a good current coming from somewhere far upstream. It was brushy in places, so the going was slow. Slow is always best for a still hunter, and that was a good thing. After making his way up the stream for what seemed like a few hundred yards, the Skinner noticed that the forest ahead was starting to brighten up a bit. Then he noticed large deer-like droppings on the ground that could only be made by a moose. The signs of browsing, the ends of small underbrush that had been snipped off, either by a moose or a very tall beaver. Up ahead there was a clearing, and as he approached he saw that it looked like it had once been a beaver flooding, but was now dry and grassy. Still being careful to step quietly and carefully, he slipped into the edge of the clearing. He saw that it had been about 200 yards across and maybe twice as long. He stood in the corner of the clearing, taking in the splendor before him, when suddenly he felt the breeze shift to the side in the back of his neck. He saw the tall grass in the field shift direction following the wind. What happened next was something he wasn't expecting, something that would test his reflexes. The noise that broke the still wilderness startled the Skinner. A loud crashing noise came from the brush just off the end of the clearing. Then a noise that sounded like somebody running along a picket fence with a big stick. Before he realized it, the flintlock was at full cock and at his shoulder in defense of whatever had alarmed him. Then his hunter's senses told him that the noise was a moose busting from his bed, and the clacking type noise was his antlers on the saplings they ran through the brush. Before he had time to think, a big bull moose burst out of the thicket into the open clearing. For just an instant the bull was broadside, but he quickly turned and ran straight away. The range couldn't have been more than 50 yards, but it was so broad across his backside, it was like putting the rifle sights on the back end of a Volkswagen. The ignition seemed instantaneous, and when the gun roared, a cloud of thick smoke blocked the view of the hunter. It hung there, refusing to rise. The Skinner dropped to his knees and looked under the smoke. What he saw made his jaw drop and sped up his next move. The bull had stopped and was looking back towards the hunter. It coughed a couple times, making the hunter think he had maybe caught a lung with that big round ball. The Skinner had pre-measured powder in a loading block, so quick as a cat, could blink an eye, a load was in the gun and the powder was in the pan. And in the meantime, the bull had continued to walk toward the opposite side of the clearing before disappearing into the brush. The hunter got off another shot. Then the bull was gone. The young hunter reloaded again and started walking ahead. And he got to where he thought the bull had been. When he fired his first shot, he watched carefully for signs of blood. At first he saw nothing, but soon there was a good blood trail to follow. The blood sign was very encouraging, and as he approached the other side of the clearing, he slowed and scanned the brush ahead for the moose. He stepped into the brush on what was an animal trail and saw by the blood that the moose had followed the same trail. He hadn't gone far when he saw a bush that looked suspicious. As he looked closer, he realized the bush was actually moose horns. The moose was down and out, and as he walked up to the animal, he was overwhelmed by his size. He was as big as a horse. He grabbed the leg and tried to pull the critter onto his back so he could field dress him. He wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he was wondering what to do when he heard a hello in the distance. He answered back, hello. His partner had heard the shots and came to find him. What you shooting at? He said. I shot a moose calf, the Skinner answered back. Oh, good, he hollered. That'll be some good eating. Then the older man came on the scene. Holy cow, he said, that ain't no calf. After telling the story of the hunting success, the old man said, I've been hunting up here for years and killed 6 moose. And I haven't even seen a moose that big, he said. That bull's got to weigh 1,200 pounds. That's big for a Canadian moose. The old man asked, where'd you hit him? Made a Michigan heart shot was the answer. The ball entered the south end and stopped on the north end, went full length of him. The Skinner said, now what do we do? The old man took off his pack, took out a saw and a small block and tackle to hook onto the hind leg and winched the bull over so they could get him field dressed. It took the rest of the day to get the moose skinned and quartered, and they hung the meat off the ground to keep it safe from bears and wolves, then headed back to camp for the night. The next morning they were back to cut and pack out the meat. A table was fashioned so that they could bone out the meat and put it in cloth grain bags that had been brought for the purpose, and carried it out in a pack basket to the waiting canoes. It was bone-tiring work, but while the old man grumbled, the young Buckskinner couldn't seem to stop grinning. The next day, both canoes, laden with camp gear and moose meat, started the long upstream journey. The trip that had taken 1 day to come downstream took 2 days fighting the current back up the river. On the second day, it started to rain. Then it turned to snow. By this time, they got out at the point both men were wet and soaked and cold. Were it worth the trouble? If you asked the Skinner today, he'd probably say, "Huh? What trouble? I hear tell he's an old man now and delights in telling the story of the great Canadian moose hunt to his grandchildren. And he has the horns to prove it."